Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on the future of rural employment and building back better. This is a session about rethinking rural employment about 9 months after we launched a paper, a study on the same topic together with CGAP. I'm joined today by Jamie Anderson and Christabel Makoka, and we're reigniting the conversation. And this session is going to be made up of 3 different videos. Looking at the question of rural employment 9 months into, well, actually a year into the pandemic, and where we are, revisiting these core questions. We invite you to go to the landing page for this session. There are a lot of resources, including the original webinars from 9 months ago, the original study, and then 3 different videos related to this session, including our kickoff conversation, and then and then 2 panels of experts, which you'll be able to see. So I'll just go ahead and start with a couple of my high-level thoughts about where we are 9 months after the previous webinar. I think in that webinar, we were riding on the tide of a bit of optimism, really looking to a lot of our partners who were innovating on digital channels, and really feeling like this could be a chance for digital solutions to have a breakthrough moment to help farmers with information and linkages. And I think that to a certain extent that was definitely borne out. I mean, the AgriFin programming related to COVID was able to reach 16 million farmers on digital channels. So that was really quite significant. We also were tasked with tracking impact of many of our pieces of work over the course of the last year during COVID. And we're very happy to see, in particular with our DigiFarm study, the idea that women smallholder farmers in the DigiFarm marketplace were able, even over the course of this year, to be increasing productivity and income, and also were able to hire more labor. And what that pulled back to was their continued access to improved inputs, markets, financial services, and the ability to learn. But I would just say from my side that on a broader scope, I would look to studies like 60 decibel study on Kenyan farmers here in over this period of COVID. They've done 9 monthly studies. And those 9 monthly studies do show the vast majority of farmers, draining their savings resources. While some prices have stabilized for them, input prices are still high, sales prices are still low. So my biggest takeaway from that 60 decibel study, which I recommend everyone take a look at, is that women in particular are all farmers, but particularly women are looking for markets. They need a place to sell. Markets are still very much disrupted. Farmers are still having a very hard time accessing credit. And they're scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of their resources now. So I think it's still, we're still looking at very serious impacts of COVID hitting smallholder farmers and affecting jobs. But when you see farmers that are in an environment where they have a good buyer, they have access to inputs, they have access to credit, they are driving new jobs in the rural landscape. So I guess those are my takeaways. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jamie and ask her to just introduce herself briefly and share her thoughts.
Thanks, Lisa. So I'm Jamie Anderson. I work at CGAP. We're a think tank focused on financial inclusion that's housed at the World Bank. And I lead our work on rural and agricultural livelihoods. And thinking back to our conversation and how things have unfolded, certainly for us at CGAP and from what we see in the wider sectors, we do see more of this discussion about the relationship between financial services and jobs and livelihoods, more of this discussion about really interrogating what we're doing. And it's not financial services for the sake of financial services, but it has to connect to people's lives and often their working lives in addition to whatever else is happening in their families and households. So I think it's still a relevant conversation, maybe because of what we're doing internally to our organization, but from what we see more widely as well. For example, CGAP is putting much more of attention on how financial services relate to MSEs and workers in the digital economy, these new sorts of opportunities, these kind of new sorts of livelihoods we see that are enabled by digital technology, different sorts of platform work, and then of course the work that we're doing in rural and ag livelihoods, which is an agenda entirely focused on women. And picking up your points, Lisa, it's the 2 areas that we're emphasizing are in labor and markets. So it's interesting to hear those threads coming out of the work that you mentioned as well, because we're really thinking about how can financial services, which is not the end all be all, but for at least the role that it can play, how can financial services, innovations, improvements start to make a meaningful difference in the way women in rural livelihoods are hiring labor on their farms and businesses and using labor saving tools and assets and the sort of decent work that they have access to. And of course, markets, local markets, markets on digital platforms. So that's a really relevant conversation for us. And of course, we're excited to think about how we can partner with Agrifin and your partners to design and test that in the field, and then others as well. So really, really relevant for us, and all of that conversation we were having still resonates in a lot of ways today. But Cristobal, what are your views, and what are you seeing in the sector?
Thanks, Jamie. So I'm Cristobal Makoha. I recently just joined Aseli Africa as head of partnerships, and Aseli is essentially a market incentive facility to unlock financing for high impact agri SMEs. So the work that we're starting to do is really relevant, I think, to what you're both sharing. I think my thoughts, I'll try and sort of go back to the premise of the study and try and highlight, I think, what's still relevant today, even though we did the study about a year ago. So about a year ago, Agrifin together with Dalberg really conducted a study to try and understand what is the scale of the challenge of youth unemployment in Kenya, and identify opportunities that exist to create meaningful employment opportunities for youth. And so a couple of highlights is, one, the challenge is quite significant. So we estimate that by 2024, I think about 10 million youth, rural youth, were going to be out of jobs and really looking to get employment. And obviously that number, I'm sure by now, is exacerbated by COVID-19. So the challenge is quite significant, and now more than ever, we really need to really think about potential interventions to meet that challenge. I think the second thing is that agriculture can play a significant role. I think we know that it won't absorb that entire 10 million youth who are looking for jobs, but it can play a significant role. And I think just hearing both of you speak, two thoughts come to mind. One is, how do we think about the role and the opportunities that exist for youth, both in direct agriculture production, but also in value-added services that are related to agriculture? So I think in the first part, really looking at how do you get youth to be more involved in direct farming activities? How do we promote farming as a business? How do we use platforms like DigiFarm to provide end-to-end services to really improve farming as a business for youth? And I think that can absorb a lot of the rural youth who do have land. I think as an example, the government of Nigeria, we looked at this in one of the case studies when we were doing the study. The government of Nigeria, in partnership with FAO and ILO, set up a program called the Youth Employment in Agriculture Program. And through that program, they were able to generate, I think, about 75,000 jobs. So it is possible to really look at how do we drive employment for youth, but looking at farming as a business, not just farming as either a side hustle or something that I inherited from the parents. How do we commercialize that a little bit? I think then the second point is really thinking about the role that youth can play and creating job opportunities in value addition. So whether that's, and I'm using the word value addition a bit loosely. So Lisa, both and you mentioned access to market as being important. One of the biggest challenges we know that women face is time poverty and not being able to actually go to the market. So again, that for me presents an interesting opportunity to look at how do youth then step in and get involved in things like logistics, field force, and I think some of our partners, for example, Sun Culture, if you look at their field force in rural areas, I think 80% of them are youth. So access to market is an important aspect, and it provides an opportunity, I think, to think about how do youth get involved in agriculture in a way that's not about direct farming, by either providing logistic services, other value-added services like a lot of ag techs right now as they're coming up, or fintech as they're coming up. How do we involve youth in that perspective in a way that's not really about the youth themselves going into the farm and farming, but really thinking about the gaps that exist in the agricultural value chain and where youth can then plug in. So I think in summary, for me, there's two things. One, we really need to look at how we get youth to be more directly involved in agriculture, but doing that as a business. And then two, looking at the gaps that exist in a value chain, and then providing opportunities for youth to be involved in filling those gaps. And I think the last thing I would say is while the opportunities are there, I think the challenges remain the same year in, year out, and it's time to really think about what different ways we can address those opportunities. So in as much as we want to drive farming as a business, I think we were estimating in Kenya only about 22% of youth actually own land. So that starts to limit how many can actually be involved in production. But then it also provides an opportunity to think about other interesting ways of doing farming. I think aquaponics or ways of doing farming that doesn't necessarily involve owning 3 acres of land. You can do a lot of farming on 1/8 of an acre. So lack of access to land is a big thing, which can provide an opportunity to think about interesting ways of farming. I think access to capital has been something that's been touted for so long, and our access to capital is very much tied to have owning assets. And again, we know youth don't own assets, similar challenge with women. So can we think about other interesting mechanisms to really measure the risk appetite and risk profile of youth in a way that's not too traditional? And then lastly, there's still a lack of interest and a lack of agronomic know-how when it comes to youth not wanting to get into farming because it's seen as a failure. So I think there's still quite a bit that we can do with, let's say, leveraging digital platforms like Arifu, et cetera, to really change the perspectives that youth hold towards agriculture. So those are my thoughts, and I'll hand back to Lisa just to hear how you can bring this together as we start to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Christabel. It's always such a pleasure to have a conversation with Jamie and Christabel on this, and I think we can see that the whole idea of rural employment and building back better is extremely important as we move forward. You know, as you guys know, part of this event for us is looking forward into climate smart agriculture. You know, to Christabel's point about learning how to make value chains more efficient and more climate smart, plugging a lot of these holes around post-harvest loss, being able to accelerate the number of harvests that we get per year, being more efficient on the land that we have is all absolutely critical. And I think that youth are a big bet for us in taking climate smart agriculture forward and meeting the increasing demand for food. So I'm glad that we're in this session, and really want to invite you to visit the landing page. Look at the resources that we have, the study that we have, the original webinar, and then look forward to the next 2 panels, which are going to be a practitioner reaction panel and a future of work panel, and making rounding out several perspectives on this challenge moving ahead. And thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Christabel, for coming back to this topic with us and relaunching the discussion, refreshing the discussion, and looking forward to the rest of the panel discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.